Good evening, everyone. I am grateful to be back with you this week, and thank you so much for your prayers last week while I was sick. That really meant a lot to me. You might have noticed on the website that there was kind of a blank space for this week under our spirituality series, and as I was talking to Sam, I said, what should we do for this week? And maybe it's just because I was really craving comfort food, or because San Francisco is like the foodie capital of the world. I was like, well, what if we just did spirituality of food? And I kind of am interested in this topic for a variety of reasons, but I've been studying it for about the last 3 years pretty intensely. So it's really difficult for me to narrow my focus tonight. And I want to just share with you that most Christian sources tend to come at this from three pretty broad angles. And the first is around environmental sustainability, right? So all those questions about how we get food, the food systems and all of that. And then another is food justice, which is closely linked. And then finally, the third is kind of eating disorders, thinking about how we treat food sometimes like an idol, right? And how that can distort our relationship to it. But tonight, because our series is called Blissed Out, I was like, you know what? None of that is really going to work for me tonight. So I wanted us to focus around a different theme, something that doesn't often come up in this conversation, and that's the role of memory. Every single Wednesday when we gather here for communion, we recall those ancient words that have rung out for 2,000 years and across literally every single continent on earth. Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in memory of me." And now, obviously, like memory here too, right, could open up this whole theological, spiritual universe of conversation. What does that mean? What does memory even mean here? So I'm going to further refine tonight's discussion into three different areas that I want to talk about. The first is how memory relates to evocation. And the second is how it brings up controversy. And the third is how it eventually leads in a reconciling way to embodiment. And now I have to say, y'all have to understand something about me. So I don't know if you know this, but I'm Sicilian. And for my people, like full disclosure, food just is spiritual, right? Like there's no way you can be in Sicily and not be completely undone just by the sheer sensuality and beauty of all the food around you. It's right up there with God, sex, and war. You know, Italians, we love to cook, we love to argue, and we love to make love. And sometimes we do all three things together. It's very strange. So this is kind of the context that we're coming at. I think, Italy is the perfect place for me to meditate based on that one line that we had from tonight's gospel. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. Because this is, of course, the land of eating and drinking. It's the volcanic soils that gave us both Botticelli on the one hand, yeah, and then also vermicelli on the other, le due, right? And both are equally glorious examples of God's goodness in creation. So, for Sicilian immigrants to the United States, I think that's probably nowhere more true than in the meatball marinara, right? It's like classic. And so I thought, I'm going to meditate on the meatball marinara tonight. That's going to be my focus. And I'm going to use that as the prism to look at this question of the spirituality of food, because my hope is that at the end of this, you'll be able to return to your own context, to your own memories and experiences of childhood, to your homes, and think about how is food a sacramental experience for you in all those places? How does it relate back to evocation, to controversy, and to embodiment? That's the hope. So, it's time for us to ladle out a little bit of evocation tonight. And back in the day in Boston, my family, like countless others, kept Sabbath with 2 sacred meals on Sunday, right? The first was in the morning at Mass, right? Bread and wine in the Eucharist, yeah. And then the second was the meatball marinara afterwards in the afternoon, with the whole family gathered around the table. And now at the first, the man presided at the table, the priest, right? But at home, there was no question who was Lord of the table, and she did not share power. Very true. Do you remember in My Big Fat Greek Wedding when Tula is really going through it and her mother says, "Tula, do not worry. The man, he may be the head, but the woman, she is the neck, and she turns the head in the direction that she wants." This is where that came from. This is where that came from. So as I was thinking about all these things, I realized, if I'm really being honest, I think I probably learned more about God from watching my grandmother make that meatball marinara than I did from years of sitting in church and listening to people like me blather on for hours and hours. Such a work of love. The time, the care, the attention that went into that meal. Such a work of love is truly worthy of God. It's a beautiful, beautiful phrase from Origin. Search out the scriptures for a meaning worthy of God. It's worthy of God and worthy of praise. And since I began this series speaking about practice as the heart of that spirituality, I thought it would only be fitting and maybe even a little hypocritical if I didn't actually try my hand at the old family recipe. But that was easier said than done. What if I messed up? What if it didn't come out like I had actually remembered? Or worse, what if it came out sort of like I remembered? Wouldn't that be even worse? I had the recipe for actually 10 full years before I ever even attempted it. It wasn't my culinary pride that was getting in the way. It was the fear that somehow my grandma's presence and my great-grandma's memory was on the line, that the evocation of these two women were present in this recipe. And now, before you think that I'm completely paranoid, the fear of losing or maiming deep ancestral memories associated with the dish were probably a lot more real than most of us might imagine. The physical act of eating and tasting is actually this complex set of interactions that happen in our mouth. And it's the combined stimulation of chemical and mechanical and thermal sensors, all kind of coming together to create this experience that we call eating or tasting. But by far, dominating them all is smell. Smell. Now, y'all know that I love me some science, and so I'm going to nerd out on you for a second, right? A simple breakdown really gives us a picture of just how huge that difference is. The human tongue can taste about 5 to 10 distinct flavors, and those combinations form all the other experiences of taste at the level of just like the tongue part, right? The human ear can hear sounds between 20 and 20,000 hertz. That's a lot of range, depending on how much you think you can kind of parse in that space. How many different colors do you think the human eye is capable of seeing? Does anyone know? What? 20? Between 1 and 10 million, even though we only have 4 cones, so, right? And some people have the power to use the 4th cone, which I'm really intrigued by. But human smell is in a category of its own. Okay, so I'm just gonna ask, how many unique scents do you think a fully developed human nose is capable of smelling? Anyone? 5? Keep going. 50, keep going. 20 million, keep going. 3 billion, keep going. 10 billion. Yeah, keep going. A trillion, keep going. Yeah, 1,000 trillion unique scents. Isn't that incredible? There was a recent study in 2014, and a fairly underdeveloped human nose is only capable of smelling about 80 million distinct scents, but a fully developed human nose can smell 1 quadrillion unique scents. That's mind-blowing, right? What on earth could account for that massive difference? Right? And so when we think about human biology and evolution, this actually kind of makes a lot of sense, yeah? Think about our ancestors back in, say, like the Ice Age. What if you are looking for a place to sleep? How are you going to know that, your friendly, like saber-toothed tiger, for example, isn't going to want to cuddle up with you, isn't going to want to be your cuddle buddy in that dark cave you're thinking of hiding out in for the night, right? If you've gotten to touch, it's probably gone too far, right? It's probably over, yeah? If you tried to lick kitty, that would end very awkwardly for everyone, right? Hearing, maybe, but cats are very stealthy, right? Smell. Smell is what preserved human lives. Before refrigeration, before expiration dates, how did you know that something had gone bad? Right? The preservation of human species was driven to a large extent by our capacity to distinguish different smells. And all of those smells are being routed through the same part of the brain that is also linked to the processing of memory and of emotion. It's the only sense organ in our bodies that is directly linked back to memory and emotion. And so with all of these things in mind, it's important for us to understand that all the things that we think of when we think of the way that food might evoke memories for us are not primarily about our tongue. It's actually about our nose. We eat only to a little extent with our tongue. The vast majority of that experience is happening right here. If someone is deprived of the sense of smell, sweet things taste the same. Imagine that. It'd be like a certain version of hell. A watermelon Jolly Rancher versus a cherry Jolly Rancher. No, they would just all taste like sugar. What is the point? Come on, right? So that's what's going on right there. I think we should move now. We can pivot from the cold ice age back into the warmth of the mezzogiorno, of the Italian landscape, and maybe if not there, then at least grandma's kitchen. The first step in making the marinara was collecting and chopping all the herbs. And since little boys love knives and dirt, my grandma always assigned that role to me, right? And I have to admit, Whole Foods was kind of a poor substitute, but I had to make do. And as I was buying each item on the list, there was just this sense of anticipation building within me. I actually couldn't wait to get home. Despite my fear that I might get it wrong, I was really excited to start this. The time had finally come for me to try my hand at the old family recipe. And as my knife cut through the basil, and as I plucked oregano leaves from their stalks, memories of sunshine and parched grass, of daffodils and sprinklers started to kind of well up from deep within me, these memories of childhood. And I could kind of hear my mother speaking with my grandmother about my great-grandmother Grace, Grazia. And now my great-grandmother Grace didn't survive for me and my mom to get to know her. She was killed one day while she was crossing the street to go to church by a bus. She was hit by a bus. It was tragic, but also just the most Sicilian way anyone could possibly go. Going to church, got hit by a bus. She was distracted. It's like, come on. And so the experience of being there and hearing these voices that I remember from childhood, all of it kind of empowered me in this whole experience, this whole moment of what it meant for us to experience food as a kind of evocation. As the meatballs sizzled, as olive oil hissed and tomato sauce bubbles burst, it was as if she were somehow there. As word and flesh combined, she was with us again. Maybe it's not a coincidence that God in Christ asks us to remember him in the breaking of bread and the drinking of wine. As the Apostle Paul says, through us God spreads in every place the fragrance that comes from knowing him. For we are the aroma of Christ to those among the world who are being saved. Food, and especially smell, has the power, the unique power, to evoke deep and profound memory. But as we also know from our tradition, that memory is not always remembered in the same way, right? Which brings us to the second point, controversy. 3 of Great-Grandma Grace's children all claim to have the real family recipe. And I did not know this until 2 days ago, or about 4 days ago. And their memory is based on oral tradition. My recipe was written down. I'm not sure which is superior, but just saying. My grandma explained that Grandma Grace used to ask her brother, my Uncle Joe, to start the family sauce so that it would be ready by the time that the father came home, right? But he didn't realize that after he asked her to start the sauce, she came home and added a bunch of herbs and made it taste really good. So whenever she went to his house, he would claim this is the family recipe, and it was meh. And she's like, this is not the family recipe. What are you saying? So that's one. Then the other is her sister, her arch rival, Aunt Rose, who has to do everything better, right? And her recipe isn't just the tastiest, the most amazing recipe in the family, according to many. She's also made it even better, right? She watches the Food Network obsessively, and she's made all these little changes, and she loves it. So we have 3 different recipes in the same family. And I don't know about you, but conflicting family recipes among Sicilians is a little bit like diphthongs among early Christians. People have gone to war over less. So we have these 4 gospel witnesses and at least one major post-gospel witness, Paul, right? That's the majority of what we call the New Testament. We also have different ways of remembering Jesus and his followers in each of those preserved oral written traditions, right? We have at least 4 branches of global Christianity who all interpret the words he spoke over bread and wine differently. Christians are no stranger to controversy at the table. Arguing over who remembers the recipe best has actually led to war. The European religious wars at the outset of the Reformation, the beginning of the 16th and end of the 17th centuries, claimed 10 million lives in Europe. And I wondered, as I read about this, how much more grace would we be able to show each other if we remembered that the point of food is not the recipe itself, right? It's the experience. It's the experience. And that brings me to my 3rd and final point about the spirituality of food. Like God, like communion, like community memory, we cannot hope to enjoy these things unless and until we actually embody them. And that process of embodiment is never exact, it's never flawlessly transmitted, and it's never the same from person to person. The way that I make the sauce is going to inevitably be different from the way that my grandmother makes it, no matter how hard I try to replicate her recipe, right? How we get from this, to this varies by technique, by direction, by how much we know, by how much we don't know, right? But even in its imperfect form, it is still infinitely better than the alternative. Imagine you're at a restaurant and you order from a menu, and you're looking forward to this juicy steak eye, right? And instead, the waiter comes out and lays in front of you a recipe. Voila. What? No, that is not how that works. That recipe is not a ribeye, okay? You're going to be very angry. You're going to be very upset. Like, you're going to think this is some kind of joke, right? And this is strange because as absurd as that is to us in that context, how often do we actually treat our own tradition, our faith, and God just like that? Think about this. How often have we as people and as the church remained just at the level of the textual, right? A people of the book, without actually enjoying the feast? The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they accused him of being a glutton and a drunkard. Jesus said, "A tree shall be known by its fruits." From the fruits of creation in Genesis to the vine planted by Noah after the waters receded from the earth, to Abram's hospitality to his divine visitors with news of a pregnancy, to Moses and the manna from heaven for Israel as they wandered, to Jacob stealing Esau's birthright with lentil soup. That better have been a good lentil soup. To David's gift of bread, raisins, and dates to all Israel as they celebrated the arrival of the ark in the holy city. To Mary's magnificent song that the hungry shall be filled with good things. To Jesus' command to remember him in bread and wine, and Jesus' first followers debating over what is acceptable and what is not to eat. To finally the marriage feast of the Lamb, where God gathers in all the brokenness and hurt of the world, where God sits down the people who you would never expect sitting next to each other at the same table, and makes them to live to laugh, to drink, and to sup together. Food shows up in everywhere and every time that covenant is on the line in Scripture. Anywhere where God, humanity, and history intersect in a decisive way, food is at the center. It's not a coincidence. In the evocation of God's presence with us, in the controversies that inevitably follow about who is in and who is out of the covenant, who is favored, most highly favored, and finally in the embodiment of God's gifts, God's beautiful gifts, we are called, like Jesus, to give our lives as food for a world hungry for justice and thirsty for love. As you approach this table tonight and you extend your hands to receive, remember that you receive in order also to be able to give. That is a feast worth attending.